The battered Honda coughed its last as I pulled into the desolate gravel lot. My hands locked in an 8-hour death grip on the wheel screamed in protest. 2 days of driving deeper into the Canadian wilderness had brought me to this collection of prefabricated structures, optimistically dubbed a logging camp. My fuel tank was bone dry, my bank account a barren wasteland, and my pride had evaporated somewhere near Prince George when I confessed to my mother that I was taking a job in the middle of nowhere. The conversation had unfolded precisely as I'd anticipated. The job advertisement itself had been maddeningly vague. General forest maintenance worker, remote location room, and board provided excellent pay, immediate start. I'd pounced on it within minutes, my resume carefully omitting my PhD and highlighting my years of manual labor. The immediate callback should have raised a red flag, but I was too desperate to care. Now as I unfolded myself from the car, my muscles feeling like tightly wound knots, I wondered if desperation had finally rendered me utterly foolish. A man emerged from the largest building, his gait a slight limp, hinting at old injuries. He possessed the formidable build of someone who had spent decades wrestling with heavy objects, his graying hair and weathered face a testament to a lifetime spent outdoors. "You the scholar?" His French-Canadian lilt softened the gruffness of his voice. "That's me, Hank," he introduced, extending a calloused hand. "I run things here." His handshake was firm, brief, and his gray-blue eyes assessed me with the keenness of someone accustomed to quickly judging new hires. I had the distinct impression he was evaluating more than just my ability to wield a chainsaw. "Long drive?" he asked, though it was more of a statement. 2 days. I retrieved my duffel bag, all that remained after my landlord changed the locks. "But I'm ready to start whenever you need me." A flicker of something crossed his face, not quite pity, but a knowing recognition, as if he'd encountered this particular brand of desperation countless times before. "First things first," he declared, producing a folded paper from his jacket. "Camp rules, 6 of them. Non-negotiable." I unfolded it, expecting standard workplace safety guidelines. What I read instead felt like a descent into someone's feverish paranoia. 1. Never enter the forest alone after sundown. 2. Should you hear your name called from the tree line, do not answer. 3. Report any new objects found in or near your cabin immediately. 4. Do not offer aid to anyone encountered in the forest after dark. 5. If lights are seen moving between the trees at night, draw your curtains and remain indoors. 6. Any breach of these rules must be reported to camp management without delay. I read the list twice, waiting for Hank to break into a smile to admit it was all a joke, a bizarre initiation. But he simply stood there, his expression as serious as when we'd shaken hands. "This is a joke, right?" I finally ventured. "Do I look like I'm joking?" He didn't. In fact, he looked like a man who had witnessed these rules being broken and carried the weight of the consequences. I folded the paper, slipping it into my pocket, choosing my words carefully. "These sound more like rules for a horror movie than a logging operation. You want the job or not?" His voice remained even, yet held a finality that suggested this was my last chance to walk away. I pictured my empty Vancouver apartment, the stack of rejection letters, my mother's disappointment echoing in my ears, and the gnawing feeling of uselessness that had consumed me for months. "I want the job." Hank gave a single nod as if I'd passed some unspoken test. "Cabin assignments are posted by the main hall. You're bunking with Zara. She'll show you the ropes. Shift starts tomorrow morning." He turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing out here, we watch each other's backs. That means following the rules even when they make no sense, especially then." As he walked away, his limp seemed more pronounced, and the way he delivered that last warning sent a shiver down my spine, as if he spoke from personal, painful experience. The cabin assignment board was exactly where Hank had indicated, and I found my name, Wes Scholar, next to Z. Brooks in cabin 7. The building was smaller than I'd anticipated, essentially a glorified dorm room with two narrow beds, a shared desk, and a window that stared directly into the forest. My bunkmate was already there, perched cross-legged on her bed, engrossed in a small leather journal. She looked up as I dropped my bag, and I caught a fleeting glimpse of dense, meticulous handwriting before she quickly snapped the journal shut. "You must be West," she said, setting it aside. "I'm Zara." She was younger than me, perhaps mid-20s, with long black hair braided down her back and the kind of earnest, intelligent eyes I recognized from my graduate school days. Her layered clothing suggested a perpetual chill, and her aura spoke of someone who spent more time in libraries than in the wilderness. "How long have you been here?" I asked, claiming the empty bed. "3 weeks. A Kurinum." She glanced toward the window, where the afternoon light was already beginning to fade. "How much did Hank tell you about the work?" "General forest maintenance." "Pretty vague." I began unpacking, hanging my meager collection of clean shirts in the small closet. "What do we actually do?" "Mostly clearing, underbrush, some tree removal, basic trail maintenance." Her answers came quickly, almost recited. "The pay's good and the work isn't too hard once you get used to it." I waited for her to elaborate, but she simply picked up her journal again, holding it protectively against her chest. "Did Hank give you the rules?" I asked. She nodded, still not looking at me. "What did you think of them?" "Honestly, they sound insane." That finally captured her attention. She turned to face me fully, her expression dead serious. "You should take them seriously. All of them." "Why? What happens if you don't?" For a moment, I thought she might actually answer. Instead, she opened her journal, effectively ending the conversation. But I noticed the way her gaze kept flickering to the window, as if she were watching for something specific. The following morning began early with a surprisingly decent camp breakfast. I sat with Zara at a long table in the main hall, observing the other workers trickle in. Most appeared to be seasoned loggers, rough-hewn, weathered at home with labor that slowly grinds the body down over decades. A few, like Zara and myself, seemed subtly out of place. "You'll be working with Kinsley today," Zara informed me, nodding toward a blonde woman chatting animatedly near the coffee station. "She's been here longer than anyone except Hank." Kinsley approached our table with a bright smile and an almost aggressive energy for 7 in the morning. Early 30s, athletic in a way that suggested regular gym visits, rather than just physical labor. Her work clothes looked fresh from a catalog not worn from years of use. "You must be our new recruit," she said, extending a hand. "Kinsley Russell. Welcome to paradise." Her handshake was firm, her smile genuine, yet something about her instantly put me on edge. Perhaps it was the way her eyes lingered on mine a beat too long, or how her cheerfulness felt more like a performance than a natural state. "West Scholar, thanks for showing me around today." "My pleasure. We're doing trail clearing in Sector 7. Easy work. Good way to get your bearings." As we headed out with our equipment, Kinsley maintained a steady stream of conversation about the camp, the work, and our colleagues. She possessed the kind of personality that filled every silence, and I found myself listening more to what she wasn't saying. "How long have you been here?" I asked as we reached our work site. 8 months. Came up from Calgary when I needed a change of scenery." She hefted a brush cutter with practiced ease. "What about you? What brought you to our little slice of nowhere?" "Needed work. This was hiring." She laughed, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Fair enough. Most of us end up here because somewhere else didn't work out." We worked in comfortable silence for a while, clearing overgrown brush from what had once been a maintained trail. The work was exactly as she described, not overly difficult, but enough to remind my muscles of their prolonged inactivity. It was during our lunch break, seated on fallen logs eating sandwiches from the camp kitchen, that I brought up something that had been nagging at me. "I noticed there's an empty bunk in the men's cabin," I said. "Did someone quit recently?" Kinsley's fork paused mid-air before she resumed eating normally. "Oh, that. Yeah, Josh decided the work wasn't for him. Left about a week ago without notice. Some people just aren't cut out for remote work. Her tone remained light, but her smile wavered for a fleeting moment. You know how it is. Some folks get antsy when they're away from civilization too long. I nodded as if I understood, but her explanation felt rehearsed, much like Zara's answers about our work. Did he say where he was headed? Nope. Just packed up and left one morning before anyone else was awake. Kinsley crumpled her lunch wrapper with an unnecessary amount of force. Honestly, if someone's not committed to being here, it's better they leave sooner rather than later. The rest of the afternoon passed uneventfully, and by the time we returned to camp, I was pleasantly tired, the kind of fatigue that comes from productive physical labor. New calluses were already forming on my hands and my shoulders ached in familiar spots. Dinner was another communal affair, and I found myself seated beside a quiet man who introduced himself as Rocco. He had the air of someone who had spent his entire life working with his hands, and unlike Kinsley's aggressive friendliness, his reserved nature felt genuine. "How was your first day?" he asked, speaking softly enough that our conversation wouldn't carry to other tables. "Fine. Trail clearing. Nothing too complicated." He nodded, cutting his meat with deliberate precision. "Kinsley show you the ropes?" "Yeah, she seems nice enough." Something shifted in his expression, too subtle to pinpoint. "She's been here the longest. Knows the area better than anyone." The way he said it sounded like a warning, though I couldn't decipher its meaning. After dinner, I headed back to the cabin as the sun dipped below the trees. Zara was already there, her journal open on the desk. I couldn't see what she was writing, but her pen moved steadily with the focused intensity of someone meticulously documenting something. "What are you always writing in that thing?" I asked, settling onto my bed. She looked up startled. "Just personal stuff, daily observations, like a diary, something like that." She closed the journal and slipped it into the desk drawer. "You should probably get some sleep. Tomorrow will be harder work." I was tired enough that sleep sounded like a gift, but as I prepared for bed, a sound made me freeze. Someone was calling my name from outside the cabin. "West." The voice was clear, distinct, coming from the direction of the forest. It sounded familiar, yet I couldn't place it. "West, are you there?" I moved towards the window, ready to peer outside to see who needed me. Then I remembered rule number 2. If you hear someone calling your name from the tree line, do not respond. My hand froze on the curtain, my heart accelerating. The voice called again, more insistent this time. "West, I need to talk to you." Against every primal instinct urging me to answer, I stepped away from the window. Zara watched me from her bed, her face pale in the dim light. "You hear that too," I whispered. She nodded, unable to speak. The voice called my name twice more before falling silent. I stood in the middle of our small cabin, listening to my own ragged breathing, wondering what kind of nightmare I had stumbled into. Through the window, I could see lights from other cabins. In one, I caught sight of Rocco standing in his doorway. Even from a distance, I could discern the profound relief on his face when he realized I wasn't going outside. 10 minutes later, a soft knock came at our door. I opened it to find Rocco on our small porch, his expression grim. "You heard it?" he said, not as a question. "Someone calling my name from the trees." He nodded grimly. "You did right not answering. Whatever that was out there, it wasn't human." The certainty in his voice, the way he spoke as if he had learned this lesson the hard way, sent a chill through me. "What do you mean, not human?" "I mean exactly that." He glanced toward the forest, then back at me. "You follow those rules Hank gave you, no matter how crazy they seem. Your life might depend on it." He turned to leave, then paused. "And West, don't trust everyone in this camp. Some people here aren't what they seem." I barely slept that night, Rocco's warning and the disembodied voice replaying in my mind. Every time I drifted off, I'd jerk awake, convinced I heard footsteps circling our cabin. When morning finally arrived, I felt as though I'd been run over by a truck. Zara was already gone, her bed made with military precision. The journal lay on the desk closed but conspicuously visible, as if she had placed it there deliberately. I found Hank in the equipment shed meticulously inspecting chainsaws, his movements reflecting someone who knew the consequences of poorly maintained tools. He looked up as I entered, his weathered face betraying no surprise at my early arrival. "Rough night?" he asked, pulling the starter cord on a saw. The engine roared to life, then settled into a steady idle. I heard someone calling my name from the forest, just like the rules said might happen. Hank cut the engine, setting the chainsaw aside with deliberate care. "Did you answer?" "No, I followed the rules." "Good." He picked up another saw, checking the chain tension. "That's why we have them." I waited for him to elaborate, to explain what had been out there, or why such rules even existed. Instead, he simply continued his equipment checker routine he'd probably performed hundreds of times in countless other jobs. "That's it," I pressed. "Someone or something was calling my name, and your only advice is to follow the rules." He looked up then, his gray-blue eyes locking with mine. "West, I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully. Those rules aren't suggestions. They're not guidelines or recommendations. They're the difference between going home at the end of your contract and never leaving this place." The way he spoke made my skin crawl, not as a threat, but as a solemn promise born of grim experience. "What happened to the people who didn't follow them?" Hank's hand stilled on the chainsaw, and for a moment, I thought he might actually answer. Then he straightened, shouldering the saw with practiced ease. "Breakfast is in 10 minutes. You'll want to eat before the morning shift." He walked past me toward the door, then paused without turning around. "And West, don't go looking for answers you're not ready to handle. Some things are better left alone." The main hall hummed with the low murmur of workers preparing for another day. I grabbed a plate of eggs and bacon that tasted far better than camp food had any right to, then scan the room for an empty seat. Zara sat alone at a corner table, her journal open beside her plate, writing between bites. I approached with my coffee, nodding towards the empty chair across from her. "Mind if I sit?" "Of course not." She quickly closed the journal, but not before I caught a glimpse of what looked like a detailed chart with time's weather conditions and what appeared to be behavioral notes. I settled into the chair, cutting into my eggs, observing her. "You're up early for someone who doesn't have to be." "I like the quiet in the mornings. Good time to collect my thoughts." She took a sip of coffee, her eyes darting toward the window where pale morning light filtered through the glass. "Is that what you're writing about, your thoughts?" Her grip tightened slightly on her mug. "Just daily observations. Nothing important. Looked pretty detailed for personal thoughts. Weather times, that kind of thing." Zara's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "You were reading over my shoulder." Hard not to notice when someone's writing charts at breakfast. I kept my tone casual, but something in her defensive reaction told me I'd stumbled closer to the truth than she was comfortable with. "It's just—" She set down her fork, glancing around the hall, as if checking who might be listening. "I like to keep track of patterns. Weather patterns, work patterns. Helps me feel more organized." The explanation came too quickly, too practiced, as if she had anticipated this conversation. "Patterns in what?" "Everything." She picked up her journal, clutching it against her chest, as she had the night before. "Look, it's really not that interesting. Just personal stuff." I nodded and changed the subject, but spent the rest of breakfast watching her. Every few minutes she glanced toward different tables, her eyes tracking specific people in a way that seemed more systematic than casual. When Kinsley walked in, Zara made a quick note in her journal before catching herself and closing it again. The afternoon work assignment had me clearing deadfall in Sector 12 with Rocco, which involved hauling fallen branches and cutting up trees brought down by winter storms. It was good physical work, allowing me to process the unsettling conversation with Hank and Zara's strange behavior at breakfast. Rocco worked with the steady efficiency of someone who had done this kind of labor his entire life, speaking only when necessary, yet communicating everything important through gestures and terse comments. We had been working for about 2 hours when I spotted something out of place. A faded, water-stained blue tarp was stretched between two trees near the edge of our work area, covering what looked like a pile of equipment. It appeared to have been there for weeks, not days. "What's under that tarp?" I asked Rocco, nodding toward the suspicious bundle. He followed my gaze and frowned. "Wasn't there yesterday?" We approached together and Rocco pulled back a corner of the covering. Beneath it sat a professional-grade chainsaw, its bar and chain meticulously clean, the kind of expensive equipment no one would simply abandon in the forest. "That's Josh's saw," Rocco said quietly, running his fingers along the handle where initials had been carved, JMM. I scanned the clearing, checking for anyone within hearing distance. "You're sure, positive. He was particular about his equipment, kept it cleaner than most people keep their cars." Rocco pulled the tarp back further, revealing a helmet, safety glasses, and work gloves arranged neatly beside the saw. "This isn't how someone packs up to quit." The implications hit me like a physical blow. Kinsley had said Josh left before anyone was awake, that he simply decided the work wasn't for him. But here was his most valuable equipment hidden under a tarp in the middle of the forest, as if someone had stashed it quickly intending to return. "We should take this back to storage," I said, reaching for the chainsaw. "Probably." Rocco helped me gather the equipment, his movements careful and deliberate. "But West, you need to be real careful who you talk to about this." We carried Josh's gear back toward the main camp in silence, both of us contemplating the significance of finding expensive equipment hidden in the forest when its owner had supposedly quit voluntarily. The chainsaw felt heavier than it should have, laden with implications I didn't want to consider. As we approached the equipment shed, Rocco slowed his pace. Josh was asking a lot of questions before he disappeared. What kind of questions? About why we never worked the same areas twice, about some of the equipment we're not supposed to touch, about what happens during the night shifts we're not invited to join. He set Josh's helmet down on the workbench, arranging it carefully beside the other safety gear. Questions that made some people uncomfortable. "What people?" Rocco glanced toward the main hall where I could see Kinsley through the window, laughing at something another worker had said. "People who have been here longer than they should be if this was really just a logging operation." I stored Josh's chainsaw with the others, but my hands were trembling slightly as I hung it on the wall mount. "You think something happened to him?" "I think Josh was smart enough to notice when things didn't add up. And I think that's dangerous in a place like this." Rocco wiped his hands on a rag, his movements methodical. "The question is whether you're smart enough to be more careful than he was." That evening, I sat on my narrow bed while Zara worked at the desk, her journal open again, despite our conversation at breakfast. She wrote steadily, occasionally checking her watch and making what looked like time-stamped entries. Whatever she was documenting, it followed a regular schedule. I was brushing my teeth at the small sink when I noticed something on the windowsill that had definitely not been there before. A small wooden figure, perhaps 3 inches tall, carved from dark wood in the shape of a person with outstretched arms. The craftsmanship was intricate with tiny details in the face and clothing that spoke of genuine skill. My first instinct was to pick it up and examine it more closely. Then I remembered rule number 3. Report any objects that appear in or around your cabin that were not there previously. "Zara," I called, setting down my toothbrush. "Was this here when you came back tonight?" She looked up from her journal, then followed my gaze to the windowsill. Her face went pale and she closed the journal quickly. "No, definitely not." I stared at the figure, my mind racing. Someone had been close enough to our cabin to place it on the windowsill without either of us noticing. Someone who wanted us to find it but didn't want to be seen leaving it. "I need to report this to Hank," I said, remembering the 6th rule. Now it's almost, the rules don't say anything about business hours. I pulled on my jacket and headed for the main hall, leaving Zara to guard our cabin. The building was mostly dark, but I could see light coming from beneath the door of what I assumed was Hank's office. I knocked twice hard enough to be heard over whatever he might be doing inside. "Come in." Hank sat behind a desk covered with papers, a coffee mug at his elbow, and reading glasses perched on his nose. He looked like any other middle-aged supervisor catching up on paperwork after a long day. When he saw me, though, his expression shifted to immediate alertness. "What's wrong?" "Rule 6. There's an object in my cabin that wasn't there before." I described the wooden figure, watching his face carefully for any reaction. What I saw was recognition, not surprise, not confusion, but the kind of familiarity that came from seeing something before multiple times. "Show me," he said, standing up and grabbing a flashlight from his desk drawer. We walked to my cabin in silence. Zara stepped aside as Hank examined the windowsill with his flashlight. He played the beam over the wooden figure for several seconds, taking in every detail of its construction and placement. Then, without asking permission or offering explanation, he picked it up and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "That's it?" I asked. "You're just going to take it?" "I'm handling it." Hank turned off the flashlight, his face disappearing into shadow. "You did the right thing reporting it immediately." "But what does it mean? Who left it there?" Hank was quiet for so long, I thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had had this conversation before. "It means someone wants you to know they can get close to you whenever they want, and it means you need to be even more careful about following the rules." He turned to leave, then paused at the edge of our small porch. "Wes, don't mention this to anyone else. Not Kinsley, not the other workers. Just follow the rules and let me handle the rest." I watched him walk back toward the main hall, the wooden figure secure in his pocket, and my questions multiplying like bacteria in my mind. The way he had recognized it, the speed with which he had pocketed it, the familiarity in his voice when he had explained what it meant. All of it pointed towards someone who had dealt with these carved figures before. Someone who knew exactly who was leaving them and why. I awoke before dawn, my stomach churning from too little sleep and too many unanswered questions. The empty windowsill where the wooden figure had been seemed to mock me in the gray pre-morning light, a stark reminder that someone had violated our space while we slept. Zara's bed was already made, her journal nowhere to be seen, the precise hospital corners of her sheets suggesting she'd been gone for a while. A folded piece of paper had been slipped under our door sometime during the night. My name was written on the outside in block letters that looked deliberately disguised. Inside, the message was brief: "My office, 7 a.m., come alone. D. Daniel." Not Hank, which meant this wasn't about regular camp business. I dressed quickly in yesterday's work clothes and stepped outside into air so cold it made my eyes water. The camp felt different at this hour, stripped of the casual conversations and equipment noise that usually filled the spaces between buildings. My footsteps on the gravel path sounded unnaturally loud, as if I were announcing my presence to anyone who might be watching from the dark windows around me. The main hall was unlocked, but empty chairs still stacked on tables from the previous night's cleaning. Daniel's office sat behind the kitchen, and I could see light bleeding under the door, along with what sounded like papers being shuffled with urgent efficiency. I knocked twice, the same way I had the night before. "Come in, West." The office was larger than I had expected, with filing cabinets lining one wall and a desk that looked like it had seen decades of hard use. What immediately caught my attention were the maps spread across every available surface, topographical surveys of the surrounding forests marked with red X's in locations that formed no discernible pattern. Some areas had multiple marks clustered together, while others showed single isolated points connected by hand-drawn lines. Daniel sat behind his desk, his reading glasses perched on his nose. But instead of the usual camp paperwork, he was surrounded by equipment that had nothing to do with logging operations: digital tablets displaying what looked like geological data, electronic devices with LED readouts tracking numbers I couldn't interpret, and a laptop showing satellite imagery of our immediate area. He looked up when I entered, and I saw an exhaustion in his face that went deeper than just losing sleep, the kind of tiredness that came from carrying an unbearable weight. "Close the door behind you," he said, his voice lacking the gruff authority I'd gotten used to. "And sit down. We need to talk." I settled into the chair across from his desk, my eyes moving between the maps and the unfamiliar equipment. This doesn't look like forest maintenance planning, because it's not. Daniel removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes with the heel of his hand. West, what I am about to tell you is going to sound impossible, but I need you to listen without interrupting. Can you do that? I nodded, though every instinct told me to start asking questions immediately. This camp isn't a logging operation, it's a research facility. He gestured toward the maps where I could now see that many of the red X's corresponded to locations I recognized from our work assignments. We're studying environmental factors that affect human psychology, specifically how naturally occurring magnetic anomalies in this area can trigger neurological responses in susceptible individuals. The words hit me like a physical blow, reframing every strange experience I'd had since arriving. The voices, the things people saw in the forest, not supernatural, but neurological. Daniel picked up one of the electronic devices, its screen displaying a real-time graph of fluctuating measurements. The geological structure here creates electromagnetic fields that can induce hallucinations, compulsive behavior, even temporary memory loss. We've been mapping the intensity zones and studying how different people respond to exposure. My mind raced through the implications, connecting pieces I'd been too focused on survival to assemble properly. The rules. You knew exactly what people would experience. We've been conducting this research for 3 years. The rules aren't superstition. They're safety protocols based on documented behavioral patterns. He leaned forward, his expression earnest in a way that felt desperate. People hear voices because the magnetic fields stimulate the auditory cortex. They see figures moving between trees because the electromagnetic interference affects visual processing. The compulsion to respond or investigate gets stronger the longer someone is exposed. I thought about that first night standing at our cabin window while something called my name from the tree line. The urge to answer had felt overwhelming, like fighting against my own instincts. How long have you been studying me? Before Daniel could answer, the office door opened, and Zara stepped inside carrying her leather journal and looking like she'd been awake for hours. She glanced between us, her expression shifting from nervous to resigned. You told her, she said to Daniel, not really a question. I told her part of it. Daniel's voice carried a warning that made my skin crawl. West, meet Dr. Zara Brooks. She's not a temporary worker looking for steady pay. She's the lead researcher monitoring this entire operation. Zara moved to stand beside Daniel's desk, her journal clutched against her chest as always. But now I understood what she'd been documenting so obsessively. Not personal thoughts or daily observations, but data, behavioral patterns, and responses to electromagnetic exposure, recorded with scientific precision. Everything I wrote down was about you, she said quietly, meeting my eyes for the first time since entering. Your sleep patterns, your reactions to auditory and visual stimuli, how quickly you adapted to the environmental stressors. I've been tracking your neurological responses since the day you arrived. The betrayal felt like ice spreading through my chest. Every casual conversation, every moment of shared fear or camaraderie, she'd been studying me like a lab rat the entire time. The wooden figure, you said it was a tracking device. Not exactly. Zara opened her journal, revealing pages of charts and graphs that documented my behavior in minute detail. Josh placed those figures as markers. He was conducting his own investigation into what we were really doing here, and he'd figured out that the camp was systematically exposing workers to electromagnetic fields without their knowledge or consent. Daniel picked up one of the maps pointing to a cluster of red X's near where Rocco and I had found Josh's equipment. Josh wasn't just asking inconvenient questions. He was documenting evidence of illegal human experimentation. Where is he now? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer wouldn't be simple. Relocated, Zara said, her voice barely above a whisper. When he threatened to expose the project, the corporate sponsors decided he was too much of a liability to simply let go. The room fell silent, except for the quiet hum of electronic equipment and my own shallow breathing. I stared at the map spread across Daniel's desk, each red X representing a deliberate decision to expose workers to psychological manipulation without their knowledge. All of us desperate enough for steady work that we wouldn't ask too many questions, at least not until it was too late. You've been experimenting on people. I said the words coming out flat and emotionless. All of us. Every worker who's come through here. It wasn't supposed to be like this, Zara said, her scientific composure finally cracking. The original research was meant to study natural phenomena to understand how environmental factors affect human behavior. But the corporate funding came with requirements we didn't anticipate. What kind of requirements? Before either of them could answer, a shadow fell across the doorway. Kinsley stood there, but the cheerful energy that had defined every interaction I'd had with her was completely absent. Her face held the cold professionalism of someone who had just been activated for a specific purpose. Corporate representatives are arriving within the hour, she said, her voice devoid of its usual warmth. The operation is being shut down permanently, which means we need to eliminate any witnesses who know too much about our activities. I stared at Kinsley, trying to reconcile the woman who had made jokes during our work shifts with the cold stranger standing in the doorway. The transformation was complete. No trace of the cheerful energy that had made her seem like the most normal person in camp remained. Corporate representative, I repeated, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. You mean you've been reporting on us this entire time? Since day one. Kinsley stepped into the office, closing the door behind her with deliberate care. Every conversation, every behavioral quirk, every sign of suspicion or compliance. The company needed someone on the ground to monitor both the research team and the test subjects. Test subjects? The words hit me like a physical blow, reframing every interaction I'd had since arriving. I hadn't been hired as a desperate worker looking for steady pay. I'd been selected as a lab rat based on criteria I couldn't even imagine. Josh figured it out, didn't he? I turned to face Zara, and Daniel, pieces clicking together with horrible clarity. That's why he really disappeared. Zara's grip tightened on her journal, and I could see her hands shaking. Josh had been measuring electromagnetic readings around the camp, using equipment he'd bought with his own money. When he confronted me with evidence that we were deliberately exposing workers to unsafe levels, I tried to convince him that the research was legitimate environmental science. But it wasn't, I said, looking at the maps scattered across Daniel's desk with their red X's marking exposure zones. You were testing how electromagnetic fields could control human behavior. The corporate sponsors wanted practical applications. Zara admitted, her voice barely audible. Military applications, ways to use naturally occurring magnetic anomalies to influence enemy combatants or control civilian populations during conflicts. What started as environmental psychology research became weapons development. I thought about the voice that had called my name from the tree line, the overwhelming compulsion to respond that I'd fought against. They hadn't just been studying how the electromagnetic fields affected people. They'd been refining techniques to make those effects stronger and more targeted. Josh threatened to go to the authorities. Kinsley said, her tone carrying the detached professionalism of someone giving a briefing. So I arranged for his removal to a secondary research facility where his exposure to electromagnetic manipulation could continue under more controlled conditions. The casual way she described Josh's kidnapping made my stomach turn. You mean you had him disappear because he was going to expose what you were doing to people? I protected the project's operational security. Yes. Kinsley checked her watch, the gesture sharp and efficient. The same way I'm protecting it now. Daniel had been silent through this exchange, but now he looked up from the maps with an expression of such profound guilt that I almost felt sorry for him, almost. They paid me to recruit specific types of workers, he said, his voice rough. People who were desperate enough not to ask too many questions, educated enough to provide interesting data, isolated enough that their disappearance wouldn't trigger immediate investigations. You targeted me specifically. The realization settled into my chest like ice. My PhD, my financial situation, my lack of family connections. You knew exactly what kind of person I was before I ever saw that job posting. The company has algorithms that scan job application databases and social media profiles to identify ideal candidates. Daniel continued, each word seeming to cost him something. Your academic background combined with your financial desperation made you a perfect test subject. Someone intelligent enough to provide useful behavioral data, but vulnerable enough to accept a suspicious job offer without adequate investigation. I wanted to punch him. The urge was so strong I had to grip the arms of my chair to keep myself seated. Every moment of gratitude I'd felt for this job, every relief at having steady income, and a place to stay, all of it, had been manufactured by people who saw me as nothing more than a convenient lab animal. My daughter needs surgery, Daniel said quietly, not looking at any of us. The insurance won't cover it, and the procedure costs more than I could make in 5 years of legitimate work. When they offered me enough money to save her life in exchange for helping recruit test subjects, I told myself it was just environmental research, that nobody was getting seriously hurt. The sound of vehicles approaching on the gravel road outside made all of us freeze. Multiple engines moving fast, getting closer by the second. "That's the cleanup crew," Kinsley said, pulling a phone from her pocket and checking the screen. "They'll be here in 3 minutes to sterilize the site and eliminate any evidence of our operations, including witnesses who know too much about what we've been doing." Before anyone could respond, the office door burst open and Rocco stumbled inside, his face flushed from running and his work clothes covered in dirt, as if he'd been crawling through underbrush. "Josh is alive," he said, breathing hard but getting the words out clearly. "I found him. There's a research facility about 2 miles north of here, built into what looks like a meteorological station. He's sedated but breathing, hooked up to machines that are monitoring his brain activity while they expose him to electromagnetic fields." The room went completely silent, except for the sound of vehicles getting closer. I could see headlights through the office window, now maybe 30 seconds away from the main camp. "We have to go," Zara said, gathering up her journal and the electronic equipment from Daniel's desk. "If we leave now, we might be able to disappear before they realize we know anything." "What about Josh?" I looked at Rocco, who was still catching his breath from his run. "We're just going to leave him there. He's been missing for weeks," Kinsley pointed out, her voice carrying false reasonableness. "Nobody expects him to be found alive. If you try to rescue him, you'll only be throwing away your own lives for someone who's probably suffered permanent neurological damage anyway." I stared at her. This woman who had eaten meals with us and shared work assignments and laughed at stupid jokes, now calmly discussing whether Josh's life was worth the risk of saving. The casual calculation of human worth made me sick. "No," I said, standing up from my chair. "I'm not leaving him there." "West, be realistic," Zara said, her scientific training making her voice sound clinical even in crisis. "The odds of successfully extracting him from a secured facility while evading corporate security are essentially zero." "And the odds are zero." I turned to face Daniel, who was staring at the maps on his desk, as if they contained answers to questions he was afraid to ask. "But Josh tried to expose what you people were doing to us. He risked his safety to document evidence that could have saved other workers from being manipulated and experimented on. I'm not abandoning him just because helping him is dangerous." The vehicles outside had stopped, and I could hear car doors slamming and voices coordinating some kind of tactical approach. We had maybe 60 seconds before they reached the main hall. Daniel looked up from his maps, and for the first time since I'd met him, his expression showed something other than exhausted resignation. "I know where the facility is. I know the security protocols and the shift schedules. If we're going to do this, I can get us in." "You're talking about suicide," Kinsley said, but her professional detachment was starting to crack. "The company has resources you can't imagine. If you interfere with their operations, they'll hunt you down and eliminate you wherever you try to hide. They're already planning to eliminate us, I pointed out. You said so yourself. Rocco moved to the window, checking the approaching lights. Decision time, he said quietly. Front door, back door, or stand and fight. I looked around the room at these people who had been strangers a week ago. A corporate operative who'd been paid to monitor me. A scientist who documented my behavior like I was a research animal. And a supervisor who'd recruited me based on my psychological vulnerabilities. None of them had been honest with me about anything since the moment I'd arrived. But Josh had tried to tell the truth, and they'd made him disappear for it. We're going after Josh, I said. Daniel, you're going to show us where they're keeping him, and we're going to get him out of there before these corporate cleanup people can finish sterilizing the evidence. Daniel nodded slowly, the decision seeming to lift some of the weight from his shoulders, even as it added different kinds of risk. There's a service road that leads to the facility. If we leave through the back exit and stay off the main paths, we might be able to reach it before they realize we're gone. This is insane, Zara said, but she was already shoving research data into her bag alongside her journal. If we're caught, they won't just eliminate us. They'll make us disappear, like Josh, and conduct experiments until our brains are completely fried. Then we better not get caught, I said, checking to make sure I had my jacket and boots, because I'd rather die trying to do the right thing than live knowing I abandoned someone who needed help. Outside, I could hear voices getting closer to the main hall, coordinating their sweep of the building. Whatever decision we were going to make had to happen now. The sound of boots on gravel grew louder, heavy, and coordinated, as if they knew our exact location. I grabbed my jacket from the back of the chair and confirmed my wallet was still in my pocket. Not that money would help us now, but old habits die hard. Back exit leads to the equipment shed, Daniel said, moving toward a door I hadn't noticed behind his filing cabinets. From there we can reach the service road without crossing the main compound. Zara stuffed the last of the electronic devices into her bag, the equipment making soft clinking sounds that seemed too loud in the tense silence. If they're monitoring communications, they'll know we're gone within minutes of discovering the empty office. Then we better move fast. Rocco left his position at the window, checking his pockets, as if taking inventory of whatever tools he carried. How far to this research facility? 2 miles through forests, but the service road makes it passable by vehicle. Daniel opened the back door, slowly checking the area beyond before stepping outside. The meteorological station cover is perfect. Looks legitimate to anyone flying over or checking satellite imagery. We left through the back in single file, Daniel leading, because he knew the route. The night air bit at my face, and I could smell wood smoke from the main hall's chimney, mixing with the sharper scent of vehicle exhaust from our unexpected visitors. Behind us, I heard the front door of the main hall open, followed by voices that carried the clipped efficiency of people conducting a search. The equipment shed sat about 50 yards from the main building, connected by a gravel path that crunched under our feet no matter how carefully we tried to walk. Daniel had keys for the padlock, which opened with a metallic click that seemed loud enough to wake the dead. Inside, work vehicles sat in neat rows, pickup trucks, and an older SUV that looked like it could handle rough terrain. "Take the Ford," Daniel said, pointing to a green pickup truck near the back. "4-wheel drive and a full tank. The service road is rough, especially this time of year." I slid behind the wheel while Rocco claimed the passenger seat. Zara and Daniel climbed into the bed, crouching low to stay out of sight from anyone watching the main compound. The engine turned over on the second try, rumbling to life with the reliable sound of a vehicle that received regular maintenance. Daniel directed me through hand signals, pointing toward a dirt track that wound away from the camp through dense trees. The headlights illuminated a path barely wide enough for one vehicle, with branches scraping against the windows, as we navigated between pines that had been growing here longer than the camp had existed. After 15 minutes of careful driving, the trees opened into a clearing where a cluster of white buildings sat behind a chain-link fence. The whole complex looked exactly like what it claimed to be a remote weather monitoring station with satellite dishes and meteorological equipment visible on the rooftops. Only the multiple antennas and the subtle hum of serious electrical systems suggested anything more complex was happening inside. Security is minimal, Daniel said, jumping down from the truck bed. They rely on isolation and camouflage rather than armed guards. The real protection comes from the fact that nobody knows this place exists. We parked the truck behind a stand of trees and approached the fence on foot. The gate was secured with an electronic lock that required a key card, but Daniel produced one from his wallet as if he'd been planning this for months. "I'll take Wes to the main entrance and create a distraction," Rocco said, checking his watch. "Give you and Zara 10 minutes to get inside and locate Josh." "Medical wing is in the back building," Daniel replied, handing Zara a second key card. "Third floor, room 347. He'll be sedated and connected to monitoring equipment, but the life support systems are portable if you need to move him." Zara took the key card, her hands steadier than I expected given the circumstances. "My access code should work on the internal systems. If I can reach a computer terminal, I can download the research data and locate any other test subjects they might be holding." The plan felt impossibly simple for something so dangerous, but I'd learned that most successful operations depended more on timing and luck than elaborate schemes. Rocco and I approached the main entrance while Zara and Daniel circled toward the rear building. The facility's automatic lights activated as we walked up to the front doors, making us visible to anyone monitoring the security cameras. "Help you, gentlemen." A security guard appeared from inside his uniform, suggesting a private contractor rather than a government employee. He looked bored rather than suspicious, as if he were used to handling lost hikers or confused delivery drivers. "GPS died about 10 miles back," I said, injecting just enough frustration into my voice to sound authentic. "We're trying to reach the highway, but everything looks the same out here in the dark." While I kept the guard's attention with questions about local roads, I could see Rocco studying the building's layout through the glass doors. The interior looked like any government facility, fluorescent lighting, beige hallways, and the kind of institutional furniture that suggested serious budgets and minimal concern for comfort. "You boys are pretty far off the beaten path," the guard said, pulling out a printed map that looked like it had been folded and unfolded hundreds of times. "Main highway is about 30 miles southeast, but you'll want to take the logging roads rather than trying to cut through the forest." Behind the guard, I caught a glimpse of Zara moving past an interior window, her bag slung over her shoulder and her access card in hand. She moved with the confidence of someone who belonged in the building, just another researcher working late on important projects. "Appreciate the help," Rocco said, taking the map and studying it with exaggerated concentration. "Long drive ahead of us." We spent another 5 minutes discussing route options and fuel stops, giving Zara and Daniel time to locate Josh and access whatever computer systems held the research data. The guard seemed genuinely helpful, the kind of person who took pride in solving problems for strangers, which made me feel worse about deceiving him. The sound of an alarm from somewhere inside the building cut our conversation short. The guard's demeanor changed instantly, his hand moving toward the radio on his belt, while his eyes scanned our faces with professional suspicion. "I need you gentlemen to wait right here while I check on that," he said, backing toward the entrance. "Don't move from this spot." Instead of waiting, Rocco and I ran toward the rear building where we'd seen Zara and Daniel enter. The alarm was getting louder, joined by what sounded like multiple phones ringing throughout the facility. Whatever they'd found inside had triggered more than just a simple security alert. We found them in a third-floor hallway lined with medical equipment and monitoring stations that looked like something from a hospital intensive care unit. Josh was conscious but barely coherent, sitting up in a bed surrounded by machines that tracked his vital signs and brain activity in real time. The electromagnetic exposure had left him weak and disoriented, but his eyes tracked our movements and he seemed to recognize that we were there to help. "Download is almost complete," Zara said from a computer terminal across the room. 60 seconds and we'll have everything: research protocols, test subject files, correspondence with corporate sponsors, enough evidence to expose the entire operation. Daniel was disconnecting Josh from the monitoring equipment, working with the efficiency of someone who understood medical devices. He's stable, but the sedatives will take hours to clear his system completely. We need to move now before security locks down the building. The files Zara was downloading contained documentation that made my stomach turn. Spreadsheets tracking dozens of workers over 3 years, detailed records of their psychological responses to electromagnetic manipulation, and clinical notes describing the permanent damage many had suffered. The scope of the operation was far larger than anything I'd imagined. We'd just been the latest group in a systematic program of human experimentation. Got it, Zara said, ejecting portable drives from the computer. Research data, financial records, and communication logs with corporate headquarters. Everything we need to prove what they've been doing to people. We helped Josh to his feet, supporting him between us as we made our way back down the hallway toward the exit. His coordination was improving, but he still needed assistance walking, and his speech was slurred from whatever medications they'd been using to keep him compliant. Vehicle outside, he mumbled, gripping my arm for support. Black SUV came in while you were downloading. Through the windows, I could see that Josh was right. A large black vehicle sat parked beside our green pickup truck, and figures in dark clothing were moving around the building perimeter with the coordinated precision of a tactical team. Kinsley, Daniel said, recognizing the organized approach. She brought corporate security. We reached the ground floor just as the rear entrance opened and Kinsley walked in, followed by 3 people in black tactical gear who moved like military professionals. She traded her work clothes for equipment that suggested this was her real job: body armor, communications headset, and a sidearm that she wore with the comfort of long practice. Dr. Brooks, I'm disappointed, she said, her voice carrying none of the warmth that had made her seem trustworthy during our weeks working together. The research data you've downloaded is classified corporate property. I need you to return those drives immediately so you can destroy the evidence of what you've been doing to people. Zara clutched her bag tighter, positioning herself between Kinsley and the computer terminal. These files document years of illegal human experimentation. And these files document legitimate research conducted under proper corporate oversight. Kinsley replied, her tone suggesting she was reciting prepared legal language. Any perceived irregularities can be addressed through appropriate channels once the project concludes successfully. Josh tried to speak, but his words came out confused and barely audible. The prolonged electromagnetic exposure had clearly affected his cognitive function, leaving him struggling to communicate, despite being awake and alert. Look at him, I said, supporting Josh's weight as he swayed on his feet. Look at what you've done to him and tell me this is legitimate research. Josh volunteered for extended observation as part of our study protocols. Kinsley said without looking at him. Any temporary disorientation will resolve once his system clears the medications. Temporary. Daniel stepped forward, his voice rising with anger I hadn't heard before. You've been exposing him to electromagnetic fields for weeks. The brain damage could be permanent. That determination will be made by qualified medical professionals, not by camp supervisors who've exceeded their authority. Kinsley made a hand signal to the tactical team, who began spreading out to block our exit routes. Daniel, you were hired to recruit test subjects and maintain operational security. Your emotional involvement with the subjects compromises your judgment. The casual way she discussed Josh's condition, like he was a laboratory animal, rather than a person, made me realize that everything I'd experienced at the camp had been part of a calculated program designed to study human psychological responses under controlled conditions. The voices of strange objects, the rules that seemed superstitious but worked, all of it had been engineered to test how we'd react to manipulation. The journalist, as Josh said suddenly, his words clearer than they'd been since we found him. Contact Vancouver's son, Maria Santos. She's been investigating sites like this. Before Kinsley could respond, Daniel lunged toward the nearest tactical team member, grabbing for his weapon in what looked like desperation, but was actually a deliberate distraction. The brief struggle gave us the opening we needed to reach the rear exit, but the sound of the gunshot that followed made us all freeze. Daniel was on the ground clutching his shoulder where blood was already seeping through his jacket. The tactical team member stood over him with professional detachment, like shooting someone was just another task to be completed efficiently. Medical attention will be provided once the situation is contained, Kinsley said, checking her watch. Dr. Brooks returned the research data, and Dr. Martinez will receive appropriate treatment for his condition. Zara looked between the drives in her bag and Daniel bleeding on the floor, her scientific training warring with what was left of her conscience. If I give you the files, you'll destroy the evidence and continue experimenting on people. If you don't give me the files, more people will get hurt right now, Kinsley replied. Your choice, doctor. What happened next felt like chaos, but I realized later it had been coordinated. Rocco tackled one of the tactical team members from behind while I grabbed Josh and hauled him toward the exit. Zara clutched her bag and ran with us, the sound of voices shouting commands and equipment clattering, echoing through the hallway behind us. We reached the vehicles as sirens started wailing from the main building, the facility's security systems activating in response to whatever Zara had accessed in their computer network. The black SUV had been positioned to block our green pickup truck, but Rocco had somehow gotten the keys to a white van that was parked near the fence. Daniel, I asked as we helped Josh into the passenger seat. He told me to get you out, Rocco said, starting the engine. Said he'd handle things with Kinsley. The sound of gunfire from inside the building suggested that whatever Daniel was handling wasn't going well, but we couldn't go back for him without risking Josh's life and the evidence Zara had risked everything to obtain. We split up, Zara said, transferring half the portable drives to my jacket pocket. Multiple vehicles, multiple routes, harder for them to track all of us. Rocco drove us to where a second vehicle was parked, an older sedan that looked like it belonged to one of the facility's employees. He and Zara took the van toward Vancouver, while I helped Josh into the sedan and headed northeast toward Whitehorse. The drive took 6 hours through mountain roads that twisted between forests and valleys I'd never seen before. Josh drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally mumbling contact information or fragments of memories from his time in the facility. By the time we reached the hospital, dawn was breaking over the Yukon River, and he was coherent enough to walk with assistance. Maria Santos, he said as the emergency room nurses took him for evaluation. Vancouver Sun investigative journalist. She's been tracking corporate facilities across Canada. Tell her about the electromagnetic research and the worker recruitment programs. I stayed at the hospital long enough to ensure Josh was stable and receiving proper treatment for whatever medications they'd used to keep him sedated. The doctors were puzzled by his neurological symptoms, but confident that most of the effects would resolve with time and appropriate therapy. While Josh was being treated, I found a quiet corner of the hospital and used my phone to search for Maria Santos. Her articles revealed a pattern of corporate malfeasance that made the camp's operations look like part of something much larger, remote work sites across Canada, where desperate employees were subjected to various forms of psychological and medical experimentation disguised as legitimate research. When I called her number, she answered on the second ring as if she'd been expecting important information from someone. This is about the electromagnetic research facility near Dawson Creek, I said without introduction. Who is this? Her voice carried the sharp attention of a journalist who'd been investigating a story for months. Someone who was used as a test subject. I have evidence, computer files, witness testimony, medical records, enough to prove what they've been doing to workers. The conversation lasted 20 minutes with Maria asking detailed questions about the camp's operations, the research protocols, and the corporate structure behind the experimentation. She already knew about similar facilities in British Columbia and Alberta, but our evidence filled gaps in her investigation that she'd been unable to document through other sources. I need you to meet with RCMP investigators who've been building a case against the corporation, she said. Your testimony combined with the research data could be enough to shut down the entire operation and prosecute everyone involved. After ending the call, I sat in the hospital waiting room thinking about how carefully I'd been selected for the camp position. My financial desperation, my academic background, my isolation from family connections, all of it had made me an ideal candidate for psychological manipulation and experimentation. The job posting had been targeted specifically at people like me, workers who needed income badly enough to accept suspicious employment without asking too many questions. But Josh had asked questions and they'd made him disappear for it. Daniel had tried to help us escape and they'd shot him. Zara had risked her career to download evidence, and Kinsley had threatened to kill us rather than let us expose the truth. I spent the next 2 hours making phone calls to RCMP investigators Maria Santos had recommended to labor rights organizations that documented workplace exploitation, and to medical professionals who could evaluate Josh's condition and document the effects of prolonged electromagnetic exposure. By the time Josh was discharged from the hospital, we had appointments scheduled with law enforcement agencies and advocacy groups that could help ensure justice for everyone who'd been victimized by the corporation's research programs. The process would take months, maybe years, but the evidence we gathered would make it impossible for them to continue operating with impunity. Josh was weak but determined, his memories of the facility becoming clearer as the sedatives left his system. He remembered details about other test subjects, research protocols, and corporate personnel that would be crucial for building a comprehensive case against everyone involved in the illegal experimentation. "We're going to make sure this never happens to anyone else," I told him as we prepared to drive back to Vancouver to meet with the investigators. He nodded, gripping the contact information from Maria Santos like it was the most valuable thing he'd ever owned. "They thought they could make us disappear, but we're going to make sure everyone knows what they did."